The gray silk was wrong for Nevada. It was a city color, a color for rooms with polished floors and delicate teacups, not for a landscape of raw sun and red dust. The dress, a traditional cheongsam with a high collar and simple lines, was the last fine thing My Lin owned, and it felt like a costume for a play she never wished to be in. It was her wedding dress. She stood on the warped planks of the territorial clerk's porch in the town of Redemption Gulch, the heat of the summer afternoon pressing down like a physical weight. Beside her, her father stared at his own worn boots, his shoulders slumped in a way that made him seem a decade older. Across from them, Mr. Harrison, the town's freight master and the architect of this day, smiled a thin, satisfied smile. He held a piece of paper in his hand, the promissory note that had shackled her family for the past year. In the clerk's office, another piece of paper waited, a marriage certificate. One would be torn up, the other signed. It was a simple, brutal transaction. The groom, Arthur Bishop, waited by his wagon. He was a man shaped by the land, tall and weathered, with hands that looked as if they were carved from old wood. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at anyone. He stared out at the dusty street as if memorizing the patterns the wind made in the dirt. The town considered him a strange, solitary figure, a lonely rancher who spoke little and kept to himself. The whispers said he was simple, that the sun had baked the sense right out of him. This marriage, Harrison had made clear to everyone who would listen, was a cruel joke on them both, the foreigner who couldn't speak for herself and the fool who couldn't manage his own affairs. The clerk, a man named Peters with a sweating brow, emerged from the office. "It's time." Her father flinched. My Lin straightened her back, the fine silk of her dress a fragile armor against the stares of the few onlookers who had gathered to watch the spectacle. She walked past Harrison, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her fear. She entered the cool dimness of the office, the scent of dry paper and stale tobacco filling her lungs. Arthur Bishop followed, his heavy boots loud on the floorboards. The ceremony was a blur of mumbled words. When it came time to sign, Mr. Peters dipped the pen in ink and held it out. Arthur took it and made a slow, deliberate X on the line next to his name. He didn't seem ashamed, merely methodical. When the pen was passed to her, My Lin signed her name in careful, precise English script. For a fleeting moment, she saw Harrison's smile falter. It was a small thing, but it was hers. Outside, Harrison tore her father's debt note into 4 pieces and let them flutter to the ground. "My congratulations to the happy couple," he said, his voice slick with false sincerity. "Bishop, you see to your wife." The journey to the ranch was made in silence. The wagon creaked and groaned, the only sound besides the plodding of the 2 sturdy horses and the ever-present wind. My Lin sat stiffly on the hard wooden seat, her hands clasped in her lap. She had expected questions, or perhaps awkward attempts at conversation, but Arthur Bishop offered neither. He just drove, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable. The landscape grew wilder, the dusty track winding through sagebrush and stark rock formations that burned under the afternoon sun. They were leaving the last vestiges of Redemption Gulch behind, heading into an immense, intimidating emptiness. This was to be her new home, a place of profound isolation with a man who was a complete stranger. The silence stretched, becoming its own presence in the wagon, thick with unspoken anxieties. She risked a glance at him. His profile was stark, his jaw set. He wasn't the fool the town described. There was a stillness about him, a deep-seated patience that felt less like simplicity and more like a dam holding back a great river. After what felt like hours, he finally pulled the horses to a halt. "We are here." The ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, a thread of green following a creek that cut through the arid land. The house was a simple clapboard structure, weathered to a soft gray, with a covered porch. A sturdy barn and a series of corrals stood nearby. It was not a place of wealth, but it was clean, orderly, and bore the marks of constant, diligent work. Everything had its place. Nothing was left to chance or decay. This was not the home of a witless man. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand briefly touching her elbow. His touch was firm and impersonal. "The house has 2 rooms," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. "This one is yours." He opened a door to a small, spare room containing a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a small wooden chest, and a washstand with a pitcher and basin. It was stark, but immaculately clean. "I sleep in the main room. The kitchen is through there. Water is from the well. Supper is at sundown." He spoke in facts, not conversation. He gave her the tour of her new prison with the detached air of a warden. Then he turned and left, heading toward the barn without a backward glance, leaving her alone in the suffocating quiet of the house. She walked to the single window in her room and looked out. There was nothing to see but the endless, rolling land and a sky so vast it felt like a weight. The cruel joke was not just the marriage, it was the isolation. Harrison had not just sold her to a man, he had sentenced her to a lifetime of silence. The first week passed in this same strange, silent rhythm. Arthur rose before dawn and worked until after dusk. He was a man in constant motion, mending fences, tending to his small herd of cattle, clearing stones from a patch of ground he seemed intent on turning into a garden. He moved with an economy of effort that was mesmerizing to watch. He never wasted a step, never made a superfluous gesture. My Lynn took over the house. She cooked, cleaned, and washed their clothes in the creek, finding a strange comfort in the familiar domestic tasks. They ate their meals in silence at the small wooden table in the main room. He would eat quickly, his eyes on his plate. She would eat slowly, her senses on high alert, trying to understand the man across from her. He was not unkind. He simply was not there. He was a ghost in his own home, a creature of the outdoors who seemed uncomfortable and out of place within four walls. One afternoon, they had to ride into town for supplies. The air was heavy and thick with the promise of a storm. Dark, bruised-looking clouds were massing on the western horizon. As they loaded sacks of flour and salt into the wagon, Mr. Harrison appeared on the porch of the general store, flanked by two of his cronies. "Well, look here," Harrison called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. "It's the loving couple. How is married life treating you, Bishop? Your bride learned to speak yet?" Arthur ignored him, securing a rope over their supplies. "You'd best hurry home," Harrison continued, a malicious glint in his eye. "Looks like a real gully washer coming. That creek of yours will wash you all the way to California. Maybe this time it'll take your new property with it." A low chuckle went through his companions. My Lynn felt a flush of anger and shame. Arthur finished tying the knot and turned. His face was a mask of indifference, but My Lynn saw the muscles in his jaw tighten. He said nothing. He simply met Harrison's gaze for a long, unnerving moment before turning to help her onto the wagon. The ride back was a race against the storm. The wind picked up, whipping dust into their faces and tearing at the wagon's canvas cover. The sky turned a sickly shade of greenish-black. Arthur drove the horses with a quiet, desperate urgency, his hands sure on the reins. The first drops of rain, fat and heavy, began to fall just as they crested the final hill overlooking their valley. What they saw made My Lynn's breath catch in her throat. The creek, normally a placid ribbon of water, had become a raging, muddy torrent. It had already overflowed its banks and was creeping steadily toward the lower pasture and the barn. "The cattle," Arthur said, his voice tight. It was the first time she had heard any real emotion in it. He didn't hesitate. He urged the horses into a gallop, the wagon bouncing violently over the rough track. He pulled up by the house, jumped down, and began unhitching the team with furious speed. "Stay in the house," he ordered, not looking at her. But she didn't. She watched as he led the horses to the relative safety of the high ground behind the house. She saw him grab a shovel and an armful of empty grain sacks from the barn and run toward the rising water. He was one man against a flood. It was impossible. He was going to lose everything. Without thinking, she ran from the house, the rain plastering the thin silk of her dress to her skin. The wind tore at her, but she pushed through it, reaching his side as he frantically tried to dig a diversion trench. He looked up, his face a mixture of shock and anger. "I told you to stay inside. You need help," she yelled over the roar of the water and the wind. He stared at her for a beat, rain streaming down his face. The argument died on his lips. He saw the determination in her eyes. He gave a sharp nod and pointed to the grain sacks. "Fill them. With mud, with gravel, anything. We need to build a levee." For the next hour, they worked in a desperate, synchronized fury. He dug, loosening the earth, and she scrambled to fill the heavy sacks, her city-soft hand scraping raw against the rough burlap and sharp stones. He hauled the sacks and slammed them into place, building a low, curving wall to turn the worst of the floodwater away from the barn. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In the heart of the storm, a strange communication passed between them, a shared purpose, a primal fight for survival. She followed his lead, anticipated his needs, her small frame straining with the effort. He worked with a strength she could scarcely believe, his body a lever against the power of the water. Finally, the rain began to lessen. The creek's furious roar subsided to a dull grumble. The makeshift levee was holding. The barn was safe. The lower pasture was a sea of mud, but the fence was still standing. They stood side by side, soaked to the bone, covered in mud, and breathing in ragged gasps. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving a deep, aching exhaustion in its place. Arthur turned and looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived, he truly saw her. He wasn't looking at the Chinese bride or the piece of property Harrison had sold him. He was looking at the woman who had stood with him in the storm. A flicker of something unreadable, respect, surprise, something more, passed through his eyes. He had faced the storm and won. But Harrison's threat still hung in the air, a different kind of flood waiting to happen. The fight for this small piece of land was far from over. Back in the quiet of the house, the storm felt a world away. A fire crackled in the hearth, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. They sat at the table, wrapped in dry blankets, the scent of wet wool and wood smoke filling the air. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was no longer a void between them, but a shared space, filled with the memory of their frantic work. Mai Lin noticed a long, deep scratch on the back of her hand, beaded with blood. Before she could react, Arthur rose, retrieved a small tin of salve from a shelf, and came back to the table. He gently took her hand in his. His fingers were calloused and rough, but his touch was surprisingly light as he cleaned the cut and applied the ointment. His head was bent in concentration, and in the flickering firelight, she saw the lines of exhaustion and worry etched around his eyes. He was not simple. He was just solitary. Worn down by a world that had never given him a fair chance. He finished tending to her hand but didn't let it go immediately. He looked up, his gaze direct and serious. He was finally going to speak, to ask about her family, her home, the life she had been forced to leave behind. She braced herself for the painful questions. But he didn't ask about any of that. His eyes drifted to a large, leather-bound ledger sitting on a small desk in the corner of the room. He looked back at her, his expression searching. "Can you read English?" he asked, his voice low. The question was so unexpected it took her a moment to process. She nodded slowly. Yes. A flicker of something, hope, perhaps, crossed his face. "Can you write it, too?" "Yes," she said again, a knot of confusion and curiosity tightening in her stomach. He released her hand and stood, walking over to the desk. He picked up the heavy ledger and brought it back to the table, setting it down between them with a solid thud. He opened it. The pages were filled with columns of numbers and scrawled notes. The handwriting was a barely legible scrawl, clumsy and uncertain. "And numbers?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Can you do sums?" "My father was a merchant," she said softly. "He taught me." A long, slow breath escaped Arthur's lips, a sound of profound relief, as if a great weight had just been lifted from his shoulders. "I can't," he confessed, the words costing him a visible effort. He pointed to his signature on their marriage certificate, the crude X. "That's all I have. My father, he taught me the land. Taught me about water, and soil, and the seasons. He knew how to read the sky, but not a book. He never saw the need. He tapped a finger on the chaotic pages of the ledger. I've been paying a man in town, a clerk who works for Harrison, to keep my books. Every season, it's the same story. The price for my cattle is lower than I thought. The cost of supplies is higher. There's always a new debt, a new fee. I know. He paused, struggling to find the words. I feel it in my gut. I'm being cheated. But I can't prove it. The numbers, they're just marks on a page to me. I can't make them speak. He finally looked at her, his eyes raw with a vulnerability she never would have suspected. That day, at the clerk's office. When you signed your name. I saw how you looked at the paper. You weren't just looking where to sign. You were reading the words. All of them. I knew it. The truth of their situation fell into place with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a marriage of convenience. He hadn't sought a wife for companionship or domestic help. He needed an ally. He needed a partner with a skill he desperately lacked, a skill that could save his home. He had chosen her not as a cruel joke, but as a calculated risk, a last, desperate gamble against a man who was systematically robbing him blind. A week later, Harrison rode out to the ranch. He dismounted with the easy arrogance of a man who believed he owned everything he surveyed. He claimed it was a social call to see how the newlyweds were settling in, but the lie was thin. He carried a leather portfolio under his arm. Arthur met him on the porch, his stance solid and uninviting. Mylin stood just inside the open doorway, watching. Bishop, Harrison said with a smile that didn't reach his cold eyes. And the lovely Mrs. Bishop. I trust you're finding our country hospitality to your liking. He didn't wait for an answer. I've brought some paperwork that requires your attention. A small matter of a loan against next season's herd. Just a formality to keep your credit in good standing at the store. He produced a contract and held it out. Arthur took it, his face impassive, and handed it to Mylin. Harrison's smile tightened. I'm not sure the lady will understand such complex legal matters. She understands numbers, Arthur said flatly. Mylin's eyes scanned the document. It was exactly as Arthur had suspected. The terms were predatory, the interest rate buried in the fine print was extortionate, and a clause gave Harrison claim to the land itself should Arthur default by even a single day. It wasn't a loan, it was a foreclosure notice in disguise. She looked up from the paper, her heart pounding. This was the moment. She could stay silent, retreat into the role Harrison had assigned her, and let him complete his theft. Or she could fight. The interest is wrong, she said, her voice clear and steady. Harrison's smile vanished. He stared at her as if she were a piece of furniture that had suddenly spoken. I beg your pardon. The rate you have written here, she continued, pointing to the line, is 3 times the territorial limit. This is not a legal contract. A dangerous stillness fell over the porch. Harrison's face darkened with fury. The polite mask was gone, replaced by the ugly face of a thief caught in the act. You insolent little. Who do you think you are to question my business? He snarled, taking a step toward her. Arthur moved instantly, placing himself between them. He wasn't a large man, but at that moment, he seemed to fill the entire porch. She is my wife, he said, his voice low and cold as creek water in winter. And she is right. Harrison's rage turned on Arthur. You fool. Did you think this changes anything? She belongs to me as surely as this land will. I own her family. I can have them thrown out into the street with a word. It was a direct threat, ugly and undisguised. Mylin felt a chill of fear, but looking at Arthur's unyielding back, she also felt a surge of something else, courage. They were no longer 2 separate, silent people trapped in a house. They were a partnership. Get off my land, Harrison, Arthur said. The words were not shouted. They were spoken with a quiet finality that was more threatening than any yell. Harrison held his gaze for a long moment, his eyes filled with venom. Then he laughed, a short, ugly sound. This isn't over, Bishop. "You'll regret this." He turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and palpable menace hanging in the air. My Lin and Arthur stood on the porch, the silence settling around them once more. But this silence was different. It was the quiet after a battle, the calm of a shared resolve. They had won the first skirmish. But they both knew the war for the ranch, and for their future, had just begun. 6 months passed. The blistering heat of summer gave way to the crisp, golden days of autumn, and then to the sharp, clear cold of early winter. The rhythm of the ranch was the rhythm of their lives, a constant cycle of hard work and quiet perseverance. But everything had changed. The ledger became their battleground. Every evening, by the light of an oil lamp, My Lin would sit at the desk, Arthur beside her, and they would go over the accounts. Her neat, precise columns of figures stood in stark contrast to the chaotic scrawls that had filled the book before. Together, they unraveled years of Harrison's systematic fraud. They found double billings, inflated prices, and records of phantom deliveries for supplies that had never arrived. The theft was breathtaking in its audacity. Armed with this knowledge, they began to fight back. My Lin wrote a letter, clear and concise, detailing the fraud. Arthur, on a rare trip to a larger town 2 days' ride away, gave it to a trusted freighter heading to Carson City, addressed to the U.S. Marshal's office. They also began to speak to other small ranchers in the area. At first, the men were wary of Arthur, the strange recluse, and his foreign wife. But when My Lin showed them how to read their own contracts, how to spot the same predatory clauses Harrison had used on them, fear turned to anger, and isolation turned to a quiet alliance. With their finances finally in order, they discovered the ranch was not failing. It was thriving. They paid off the last of their legitimate debts and even had a small surplus, which they used to buy 2 new milk cows and repair the barn roof before the first snow. Their partnership solidified into something deeper than a business arrangement. He taught her the ways of the land, how to read the weather in the clouds, how to find the wild herbs that grew by the creek, the names of the constellations that wheeled across the vast, dark sky. She, in turn, opened the world of words and numbers to him. Slowly, painstakingly, she taught him his letters. He practiced for hours, his large, calloused hands struggling to form the delicate shapes, his brow furrowed in concentration. The first time he successfully wrote his own name, a slow, triumphant smile spread across his face, and something warm loosened in My Lin's chest. The separate rooms were no longer separate. The small house had become a home. The grey cheongsam, the last relic of her old life, was carefully folded and placed in the wooden chest at the foot of their bed, replaced by practical denim trousers and warm flannel shirts. One cold December afternoon, 2 riders appeared on the horizon. One was the U.S. Marshal, a grim-faced man with a silver star on his coat. The other was one of the ranchers they had spoken to. They didn't stop at the ranch but rode straight on to Redemption Gulch. 2 days later, word came that Harrison had been arrested, his freight business impounded pending a federal investigation. His reign of quiet terror was over. That night, the air was sharp and cold, and the sky was a black velvet cloth strewn with diamonds. Arthur and My Lin stood on the porch, wrapped in a shared blanket. He pointed a finger toward a bright cluster of stars. "That one there," he said, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "That's the winter circle. My father used to say that as long as you could see it, you'd never be lost." She leaned her head against his shoulder, the rough wool of his coat familiar and comforting. They stood in a comfortable silence, watching the stars. The world that had once seemed so vast and intimidating now felt like their own. He reached for her hand, his fingers lacing with hers. "I never knew what this place was missing," he said softly, his breath misting in the cold air. "Not until you got here." She looked up at him, at the quiet strength in his face, and knew that she was finally home. It wasn't the life she had ever imagined for herself, but it was a life they had built together, forged in silence, tested by storms, and proven in the simple, steady truth of a balanced ledger. They were 2 solitary people who, against all odds, had found in each other the missing part of themselves. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.